Shalom and welcome back to the Rabbi Avi Show, a production of Horizontal Media. I'm your host, Rabbi Avi Alpert, and I'm so glad you've joined us for this conversation. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to take a quick moment to ask for your support. This show and the entire Horizontal Media Network is dedicated to bringing you raw, intellectual, and completely unfiltered explorations of Torah, philosophy, current events, and Jewish life. We can't produce this kind of deep, long-form content without our listening community. If you find value in these episodes, please consider supporting our efforts financially by visiting patreon.com/horizontal media. Whether it's a small monthly donation or in a larger partnership, your contributions keep the mics on, allow us to maintain our production standards, and keep these critical dialogues going. Now, today's guest is someone with an incredibly rich, multi-dimensional perspective on faith, freedom, and public service. We are sitting down with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Dr. Jasser is a U.S. Navy veteran, a practicing internal medicine physician, and cardiologist up in Phoenix, the founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and a Republican candidate for U.S. Congress in Arizona's 4th District. In this hour, we are going deep. We discuss his critical diagnoses of the political gridlock in Washington, the necessity of a true reformation within Islamic thought, the profound parallels between modern political groupthink and religious authoritarianism, and why he, a devout Muslim, passionately champions the secular framework of the U.S. Constitution and an unwavering relationship with the State of Israel. This is a masterclass in independent thinking. Put your seatbelts on. Here's my conversation with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Dr. Jasser, what a pleasure to have you on the Rabbi Avi Show. Welcome.
Great to be with you, Rabbi. Thanks for having me.
Let's just jump right into it here. Dr. Jasser, you have an incredibly varied background, a Navy veteran, a practicing physician in Phoenix, a religious reformer. You ran in 2024 and you are back in the trenches for the upcoming primary. What's the acute issue right now that makes you feel Congress is the essential place for you to apply your unique skill set?
Yeah, as you know, not only have I served in the military for 11 years, but after 9/11, as a physician in primary care, I realized as a Muslim, the folks making money from Islam were the problem, and the folks that were regular Muslims that appreciated Americanism and escaped political Islam were the solution. And here we are 25 plus years later, and we're still looking for solutions. But ultimately realizing that what I talked about regarding radicalization of the Muslim community, I said, listen, it's not just about Muslim. It's going to radicalize the left. It's going to radicalize America. It's going to tribalize us. And all of the pathologies that my family escaped in Syria and the Middle East and came to embrace in Americanism are here. And the DEI programs, the identity politics, the tribalization, the shift of Islam being an ideology, which it is, to being an identity politic and a race, which it isn't, is really what radicalized the left. And you see this red-green axis, the Chinas and the Qatars of the world investing billions in radicalizing Americans, and still 90+% of the attention of America is paid to our politicians. So the politicians, unfortunately, even though they don't garner as much respect, really, they're in the lowest of the polls they've been ever. Still, the dominance of the bandwidth of the narrative, the agenda of America is guided by Washington. And ultimately, that radicalization needs people that are normal, that have not been in politics their whole life, that understand what are the agendas of regular Americans at the kitchen tables, be it about healthcare affordability, about border security, about national policy, foreign policy, why allies like Israel are our truest and most synergistic allies. So those issues need people to prosecute them that get it. And I think I get it as the son of immigrants. I get it as somebody who believes in the American dream and has been able to live that American dream. So that's why I'm running. We need normal people in politics. We need people that understand the agendas and understand what has torn our country apart in the era after Obama and Biden.
This is exciting. I think we need more normal people in politics, so maybe you'll start a trend here.
Amen.
As a physician specializing in internal medicine and nuclear cardiology, your day-to-day job relies on evidence-based diagnostics, I presume. Looking at data, finding the root pathology and prescribing a treatment. When you look at the current legislative gridlock in Washington, what is your diagnosis of the systemic pathology, and how does a medical background change how you approach policymaking?
I have a number of areas I could go with that, but I'll tell you a couple things. First of all, I'm in primary care. I know there's a number of doctors in Congress, surgeons and other specialists. But as a primary care physician, I build coalitions to take care of every one of my patients every day. So I'm still believe in traditional old-fashioned medicine where the primary care doc is the attending, is the quarterback. And then I get a coalition of cardiologists, oncologists, respiratory specialists, pulmonary specialists, nephrologists, whatever it might be, surgeons to do the specific task and then continue the longitudinal long-term relationship with my patient and their family. That's a coalition that comes together. Many doctors might disagree on many things, but I find the ones that agree on that patient and that disease and the condition and the treatment necessary, with the patient driving that treatment, and I'm simply the lead consultant, if you will. I grew that, at 2011, I testified to Peter King's hearings, and I said the first sentences of my testimony were, Chairman King, I said, I'm a doctor. I treat disease, but if I only mask symptoms, I'd be in malpractice court all the time. What I treat is make the diagnosis, but then I invoke the right treatment with the right group to make that treatment. And the radicalization of Muslims is part of a deeper problem of a faith community that has a faith that's 1,400 now and 47 years old and has not gone through an enlightenment, a second enlightenment, and a reformation, much like Judeo-Christian history did in the West, that ultimately created the greatest country on the planet, which is American democracy, against theocracy. And Islam has not gone through that. So that's the treatment. And I remember Congresswoman Jackie Speier from California interrupted me and saying, listen, I'm a Catholic and I would never presume myself to be the one to take on the Catholic Church on what is and is not Catholicism. And I said, ma'am, you completely inherently misunderstand these halls that you purport to represent your constituency in. This Constitution, this government was founded on the battle against theocracy, was founded that the people making money from religion, the establishment, were the problem. And our First Amendment is founded in preventing the establishment of religion. So in Iran, in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood, in Syria against ISIS and others, and Hamas, the way they defeat these viral permutations of both grassroots radicalism and top-down corporate radicalism is to separate mosque and state, to create an identity of a country based in an idea that gives equal rights to all, whether they're in Islam or not, and that the rights don't come from Islam, they come from God. And I think Supreme Court Justice Thomas said it best a few weeks ago, in which he said, in Texas, he said, progressivism is really an illness because it is not American. It's incompatible with Americanism. It says that rights come from government and are to be guaranteed by government, and they're not. They come from God. And I said, listen, if you substitute the word progressivism with Islamism, you'll understand what is destroying and what has destroyed 56 countries in the world that are Muslim majority, which is the ideology of political Islam. So as a doctor, the treatment is anti-tribalism. The treatment is meritocracy against identity politics. The treatment is to negotiate ideas with the merit of those ideas and not simply based on apologetics and victimology and somehow making us start from a position in which we apologize for things from before us, but rather look at the future. The treatment is free markets. I'm a doctor. Right now, the unaffordability crisis in America is based in healthcare, which has gone up 400% in the last 10 years. And during COVID, I saw my profession as a primary care doc radicalized and also weaponized by the government to take away the rights of families. And I saw disease trading where fear, and this is another treatment that it needs to be treated, is we became a country which was supposedly based on taking risks. It became risk averse. And that risk aversion caused us to shut down businesses, to make decisions where my kids were being kept at home for no reason during COVID. And they weren't the ones getting COVID, and yet the NEA had the power to shut down schools and make us make decisions which were un-American. And I saw people dying at home from heart attacks, my patients, from bowel obstructions, from things because the government said stay home. And the insurance companies were minting trillions because elective healthcare went down to zero. They were saving money because they were also hospitals and insurance companies. So the whole problem was not really using evidence-based medicine, but actually using demagoguery, fear-based politics, and a lack of actual conversation about what it is that we would make decisions during COVID. And the same thing with Obamacare, which now has monopolized and vertically consolidated healthcare in America, where people can't decide anymore what the costs are and go to the best doctor they want and pay for a little more but get better quality. No, it's now basically a socialized system with the United Healthcares and others have become a second government trying to destroy private and small practices like mine.
There's a lot of passion there, a lot of passion, which is good to hear. On this show, we talk a lot about independent thinking and intellectual loneliness, navigating spaces where you don't perfectly fit the dominant mold, which is a little bit of what you're talking about, the pressures that we have from these different segments of our society where there's pressure to fit that mold. You are a conservative Republican, a devout Muslim, and a champion of anti-Islamism. You've faced immense pressure from both the progressive left and radical elements within your own faith community. How have you maintained your ideological equilibrium in what can often be very polarizing or lonely political arena?
Well, listen, Rabbi, what I think has been amazing about my recent foray into politics has been what people perceive as the tribalization of American politics is really something that's more of a reality of X and Instagram versus a reality of realpolitik on the streets and my practice and the communities. I mean, I've got families that are supporting my campaign that disagree with me on a lot of issues, but yet because they trust me as a doctor, because I've taken care of their families, because they know when all the chips are down, I do what's right and I don't just shift they know I'm the most vetted Muslim public speaker, publicly active activist in the country in the West, if you will. If you look at from my speech to Oxford a year ago and others, I've been consistent on the fact that I'm against political Islam. I believe Sharia is an instrument of supremacism, but yet I love my faith. So I'm not somebody that's going to sign on to just anything that's Islamic is bad. I fast, I pray. So they understand that I'm consistent in these values. So that consistency, I think, is what people look for. And that's why I've been able to build a coalition of folks that sort of are seeing within me. For example, even within the conservative movement, I've been endorsed by Turning Point Action and also by the more traditional conservatives from before the Trump era, and brought them together because they see within me somebody that's been clear on a number of issues, from healthcare to political Islam. So, when you look at those coalitions, both within the conservative movement and across, as a physician, I've chaired a bioethics program in the largest teaching institution here in Maricopa County University for 27 years. And to me, the center point of what we want in our members of Congress and our elected representatives is somebody we can trust, because character is destiny. And we want consistency. So ultimately, I think that's really what public service is about. When I served in the Navy, I served because I wanted to give back to a country that was the only thing I would ever die for is America. I don't believe in, the way to destroy jihad as a movement is to say, you know what? My kids were raised to say we would never want to die for Islam or jihad. God doesn't need us to die for him. But our country does, because we're one generation away, as Reagan said, from losing those rights. So there might be things I disagree with the left on, but there are things that bring us together as Americans, which is meritocracy, the right to equal access to businesses and the American dream and all these things, to free speech that we should be able to I defend to the death, folks, the ability to leave Islam, to say Islam is, whatever negative they want, and also to attack institutions. That's fine. But that right is defended equally. So when my good friend Charlie Kirk gets assassinated, and I've been close to his family for over a decade, um, the left and all people of all politics should speak out against assassination culture with the same energy that they do when they speak out against violence against ICE agents, against riots that, whether it's George Floyd or whatever it is. But yet you see these non-heroic people, where Charlie Kirk, to me, was a hero. He was going to campuses where my daughter just graduated from Tucson as a senior in
Wonderful.
philosophy and physiology, was a writer for the newspaper at the University of Arizona. And basically she was taking on issues. And I think that Charlie Kirk was also trying to do the same thing, just to have them debate and validate their ideas. And yet that was somehow put at an equal level as the wanton violence that we see sometimes on the left when Charlie Kirk was assassinated. But this is why we need folks that, I think, the ethics of discourse, of public discourse, as we dissect the ideas into their root, the things that we agree on. We can't do that anymore, where it's all about 10-second video clips and just tribalization of our country, as separating them with a wide chasm in the middle, versus what are the issues we share, whether it's definition of men and women, whether it's the idea of access to healthcare versus mandated government healthcare. There's so many issues that we really still share in that 80%, but the bandwidth of the conversation that America is having is not about those things that we share.
Well said. There's a lot to unpack there, but I want to say that you clearly are part of the meritocracy, and I'm sure that your parents really raised you in such a beautiful way to be where you are at this point. And I think all immigrant parents would be thrilled to have a child like you. Moving forward in this way, and what a dream to be a part of Congress. And your life's work, and this is, I know, one of your babies that you founded, the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, deals with separating mosque and state while preserving faith. How do you navigate the reality of Islam as a total legal system, like you said, Sharia, while passionately defending the secular framework of the U.S. Constitution?
That's a great question. And ultimately, our mission statement at the American Islamic Forum is that we believe in protecting and defending the U.S. Constitution through the separation of mosque and state. Because the Islamic State, the concept of political Islam, dividing the world into the land of Islam and the land of war, or Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Harb, as it says in Arabic. Most, 98% of the clerics that are leading doctrine of Islamic thought, there's only 4 schools in the Sunni tradition and maybe 1 or 2 in the Shia tradition left. And whether it's Hanafi, Hanbali, Maliki, or Shafi'i, those 4 schools of thought essentially are the same thing. There's really no diversity. While back in 1000, 1100, over a millennium ago, there used to be 4,000 schools of thought. So Bernard Lewis talks about in his book, What Went Wrong, he talks about what happened to ossify critical thinking and diversity within the Muslim communities from Spain all the way to Indonesia. And while a lot of this, if as you see online with folks that attack some of the work that I do, they say essentially Islam cannot be separated, and that it is not a faith, it's a political movement. There's no doubt that that political movement is the root cause and dominates mosques across the planet. If you look in America, the Islamic Society of North America is a Muslim Brotherhood product. It came from that cancer cell in Egypt called the Muslim Brotherhood Political Party. But the ideology, if you want to treat it, imagine living in Europe in the 16th and 17th and 18th century and saying, well, Christianity can't be separated because there's no secular democracies anywhere, no liberal democracies, and it doesn't matter what Kant, what Locke and Jefferson, all these people might be saying into the future or present, that Christianity is done. There's no way to separate it. Well, there was and you had scholars pointing to the Bible saying it says render unto Caesar what is Caesar and unto God what is God, but that doesn't mean anything because it's dismitted. It's an abrogated verse, as they say, whatever it might be. Now, those are, I'm putting in some Islamic things in there, but abrogation is how many of the folks that say that I'm tilting at windmills is how they say that, well, the Islamists abrogate the verses that are more moderate, and therefore it's impossible to moderate. And I say, well, this is the problem, is that you have today's Islam is petro-Islam, Saudi Islam, Qatari Islam. Those are power tribes that figured out how to maintain tribal control by defining what the faith is, and by then killing and slaughtering people, putting them in prison. The people in prison in Saudi Arabia, as much as they might be our ally, most of the people in prison are the ones questioning authority. Same thing in Iran. Today, the internet got turned back on a few days ago, and you see tens of thousands in the streets. There's 90 million people, 90 million souls in Iran. 5 to 10 million believe in the IRGC, which is a lot, and they're controlling the government since 79. But 80 million do not. And many of them left the faith. That's why I think if you look as somebody who loves my faith, the largest exodus from a faith into atheism is in Iran and the planet. That's because what they're selling is a horror show, is terrorism, is fear. They're not selling love. And if you look at Reformation and Christianity, somewhere in the Dark Ages, they shifted from being about hell and brimstone and hate to being about the love of Jesus and reformation. And Islam has to go through that same type of reformation. And our American Islamic Forum understood from the beginning. We said, listen, here's 17 principles we believe in. We know this isn't going to happen in our generation, but what can happen is the relegation of political Islam and the Islamists into the university settings for debate, and get them out of government and public power structures, so that the Wahhabis of the Saudis, the Khomeinis of Iran, the Muslim Brotherhoods of Egypt are no longer dominating Western Muslim narratives, and instead we allow the philosophers, the secularists, the agnostics, and others to begin to have this debate. And this is where Muslims that have influenced me in AIFD are Fatima Marnesi, she wrote about Islam and democracy, Abdullah Naim out of Emory University, Abdul Karim Soroush out of Tehran, who wrote a book called Liberalism and Islam, Mustafa Akil. There's so many scholars that take up much of that bandwidth, but they just don't have any money behind getting their message out, like the trillions that are dumped by the Saudis and other petro-Islamic dominating archaic medieval interpretations of Islam.
Here in our studies of Torah and Jewish tradition, we've looked at the danger of what scholars call godolatry, the blind, uncritical worship of religious authorities, kind of like what you're talking about, even though you have petrodollars involved as well. So this blind, uncritical worship of religious authorities or infallible clergy. You have spent decades fighting the authoritarianism of theocracies, as you're speaking of, and radical imams who demand absolute allegiance. What parallels do you see between the religious authoritarianism you fight globally and the ideological conformity or institutional groupthink we see creeping into American civil life?
There is none more similar. There's two things. I want to make sure you keep me. I want to talk about anti-Semitism, which is part two of this conversation. The first one I mentioned during COVID, the discussion on COVID, which is every debate I had with an imam. Initially, when we started our organization in 2004, we opened a national debate again, and you'll see many of those videos still online, where I debated imams. And they spent the hour and a half saying, I don't have the qualifications. I don't have a degree in Sharia. I'm not an imam. And meanwhile, they had no degrees in anything but Islam. And many of them got it online through Al-Azhar or through a Saudi university. And they really had no practical understanding of Western liberal thought, haven't studied philosophy, journalism, any of the humanities, which is interesting. Western universities, when they open campuses in Qatar and elsewhere, it's always engineering or STEM schools. It has nothing to do with liberal humanities and liberal arts, which is really what makes us human beings. As much as I love, and I'm a STEM, product as a physician, but at the end of the day, it's humanities that makes us human, and that's why you don't see any of that critical thinking and human conflict, adversarial type of debate happening. So they would attack me, and meanwhile, I would attack their ideas, the Sharia, and say this is, the Sharia gives Muslim women a quarter of the inheritance. It says to chop the hands of those who steal. One passage says don't take Jews and Christians as friends, while another passage says we can marry them. So I tell them, to me, it means the word friends is not right. It's a legal word that's being misinterpreted intentionally by the Saudis. And on the other hand, I'll say, the Saudi Quran has, our opening passage says a footnote next to those who go astray, which says like the Jews and Christians. And I'll say, why did you guys add that into the Quran? That's not even there. And yet we can marry a Jewish woman as a wife. So that doesn't make any sense. So they don't debate those ideas. They just dismiss me as not qualified. So then let's come to COVID. All of a sudden in COVID, America, the center of free speech, Fauci et al. Decided that they were the experts that could decide which vaccine my patients could take or had to take, or we could ostracize. They were the experts that all of a sudden came up with some fabricated 6-foot thing with a mask, which they had no evidence about. And if you debated it, you were somehow, they needed the virtue signal. And we were the ones who were wrong, even though I was trained in allopathic. I wasn't a naturopath debating this. I was an allopathic MD ethicist debating this, saying, listen, you guys, when I want to create that coalition of doctors to take care of my patient, I often can't find 3 doctors to agree on one plan because you're so worried about being sued. And now all of a sudden you became a tool for an oppressive exploitation of a virus to take over society and shut down businesses. So it was exactly the same thing that I see within my own faith community. While with the secularists, their faith is government. It's just some, and the DEI programs got, expanded, etc. So I can't tell you how parallel that is, and how the Islamist, and when you wonder why the Code Pinks of the world go to Tehran, when you wonder why the Hassan Pikers, who are radical gamers, and what their affinity is for the communist parties in Cuba and China, that's what it is. They're collectivists who don't have respect for individual rights, who believe that government should always control distributions. You see it happen with Mamdani now. It's not a surprise that on the heels of that popular uprising that they've had with the Democratic Socialists of America Party, they're now starting to nationalize and take over companies. And I will tell you, last to end on this, the AOCs of the world, if you listen to what she says about the corporate America, I'm saying some of the same things in my campaign, which is they don't care about individual patients. They want to deny health care through their insurance companies. So Bernie Sanders and AOC are saying some of the same things, but their solution is to even destroy individual rights even more by giving that access to government and control to single payers, control to a progressivist government-controlled society, which is entirely un-American and doesn't work and is a proven failure, which is why people are leaving to the California states and going to Texas and other more conservative, free market friendly states.
I want to switch gears here for just a moment. We can kind of get back to anti-Semitism and some other
good. I didn't want to forget that because it's really connected, because we see it on the right and the left, and I want to talk about that.
That's true. As a first-generation American, as we've said, and as you've mentioned many times, living and working in Arizona for over 25 years, you've seen the direct local impact of federal immigration failures. On your platform, you explicitly tie the chaos at our southern border to national security, citing a blind spot toward transitional threats. If elected, what structural or legislative reforms would you champion on day one to secure the border while fixing the broken, backlogged system?
That is so important, because that is really the job of the federal government, is, the fact that um, the Congressman Stantons of the world sort of sat on their hands as we allowed a pouring in, a hemorrhaging of tens of millions, over 10 million to 15 million unknown folks through our border, and families like mine for decades wait in line in other countries, not here. They wait in other countries trying, and then when they got here, my parents asked for political asylum and they got it. This was in the late 60s. So we see so many families. I have people that work for me that had been waiting for a decade to have their cases heard, and just one of my employees just got her citizenship a few years ago because she waited and got asylum, and she was worried about whether they were going to be deported, etc., if she didn't win her case, and she got it, and she's originally from Syria. So, that's the reality, is that if you have the rule of law, you either abide by it or you recognize that others are going to exploit it. And this is what happens. It's sort of like the debate about the Second Amendment. They want to take away the rights of many of us who have the right to bear arms to protect our homes, because they say that somehow we're the ones that make it risky, when in fact most of the people who commit crimes with guns are the ones who don't even care about the law and are violating it to start with. So this is what happens. I have a patient who owns a drug addiction facility here in Maricopa County, and she told me the January 2025, out of the 110 beds, over 100 of them, 90+% of them, were fentanyl overdose patients. In January 26, I talked to her in December, at the end of the year. 1 year later, she said it was down to less than 10 beds fentanyl overdose, and that was in 1 year. So if the drug addictions, the fentanyl pouring across the border 200 miles south of our district here in Maricopa County is doing that to addicts, imagine what it's doing to crime. Imagine what it's doing to security. And then you look at the New York Times. This is no right-wing conservative newspaper. The New York Times did an expose in the New York Magazine about Hezbollah's operation with drug programs globally, and what they were doing in Mexico with the drug trade to bring in cells across the border into America. And Hezbollah is much more active because of Iran and its reach to try to get into here. And we've been worried now, as we are finally fixing the problem in Iran with a Trump administration that is actually addressing it and not kicking the can down the road as so many administrations have. The border left us vulnerable, and we see a significant increase in terror threats and security folks. I mean, even when we vet people coming across the border, Rabbi, we're not vetting for political Islam like we should. I testified that we should, and they said, oh, we need to vet just for terror groups, etc. And I said, listen, that's like a whack-a-mole. They change the letters. They change, one day it's Holy Land Foundation, next day it's Kind Hearts, next day it's Hamas. I mean, you can't just vet for organizations. You need to vet for ideology, and we did it in the Cold War. And we did it by asking them, are you a member of the Communist Party? Now, most say, well, they could lie. Well, first of all, most won't lie. But the ones who do, at least you have it written that you've lied. And now, as we see, when we finally adjudicate the process, we send them back, because one of the main reasons you send them out is you say you lied on your paperwork. You were a member of Hamas. You were a member of this organization. So bottom line is, that's an important part of the security posture. And what we can do federally is stop giving our constituencies whiplash from administration to administration, codify the laws so that the president can't just come in and open up the border. Mayorkas should be, I think, brought to Congress for treason, because he testified years ago that, oh, there's no problem with the border, et cetera. And now he actually publicly 2 weeks ago said, oh, well, maybe our policy was wrong-headed and it did cause security problems. Really? Now he's saying this after he was the guy that ushered in the millions unfettered into this country.
We can't afford to make those mistakes, that's for sure. As someone who served as an internist for the U.S. Congress and has a deep understanding of Middle Eastern geopolitics, as you've already displayed for our listeners today, especially regarding Syria and Iran, how should the United States position its foreign policy? Specifically, how do you view America's strategic relationship with Israel, and what is the path to countering Iran's proxy networks while fostering a reform-minded anti-Islamist coalition globally?
Well, I'll start at what I've envisioned as a solution. When I started our organization. I got to be close to Senator Kyle here in Arizona. He introduced me to Senator Lieberman, and they had chaired for decades an organization called the Committee for the Present Danger, CPD. CPD in the late 20th century was the public-private partnership that led what ultimately became the Reagan strategy against the Soviets. And CPD, Lieberman and Kyle were the penultimate example of bipartisan coalition that then built through organizations of Hudson, Heritage, AEI, and others in the Beltway and nationally that said, we are focused on how can we defeat the Soviets without firing one bullet against them. We had proxy battles against the Soviets, but thankfully we never went to war. The postures that we developed to increase strength, the defense, peace through strength, et cetera, was all through CPD's work. Come 21st century, we came together, we formed within the Muslim community our Muslim Reform Movement, and people can check it out at muslimreformmovement.org. And that was within the Muslim community. And we formed it in 2015. We came up with a 2-page declaration called the Declaration of the Muslim Reform Movement. People should take a look at that. You and I could spend a whole
We're going to put
podcast
that
on that issue.
Yeah, and we're going to put that in the show notes, everyone. So please take a look at the show notes on that.
Yeah. So there's a 2-page declaration. If you need one document to vet who are the Muslims that are patriots versus the ones that are Islamists, that's the document. And that's been there now for 12 years almost. And we have yet to have an Islamist group that has even tried to take us on it, because it really does separate the wheat from the chaff, the Islamists from the patriots. Equality of men and women, a belief in a secular liberal document, not a Quran being the Constitution, all these other, it's in there. So we tried to get that to get traction. It didn't get as much traction because we didn't have the petrodollars. There are about 30 of us in this reform movement from Canada to Europe and in the United States, and we've become stronger. But then we said, let's broaden that to a coalition, and we formed the Clarity Coalition. So Clarity stands for Champions for Liberty Against the Reality of Islamist Tyranny, and that was patterned after CPD, the Committee for the Present Danger. We said, listen, the present danger is Islamist tyranny. How do we prevent the West from being destroyed? So really, our mission for that coalition is to take a diverse group of organizations, includes Middle East Forum with Daniel Pipes, Hudson Institute, Center for Security Policy, counter-jihad organizations, Washington Institute, Near East Affairs, just a lot of folks you probably know in this space. But also left of center, American Jewish Committee and these Center for the Study of Islam and Pluralism. So there were a lot of different organizations that came to create this coalition. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I was on her board for a while with the Ayaan Hirsi Ali Foundation, folks that understood the threat, but yet the premise we said is, okay, but Muslims need to be part of the solution. Because there is a faction, the anti-jihad faction, the Robert Spencers of the world and others that say, well, there is no solution within Islam. We just have to build a wall, to prevent them from coming in. That's not a solution. It's not an American solution. And I think it's not validated by the lived history of what you and I started talking about at the beginning of this program. So Clarity Coalition looks at that. And for example, the Anti-Sharia Caucus in Congress has 67 plus members. We've tried to support them. Their recent hearings went a little south of some of our mission because it basically said that Islam is the problem, and we put out a press release just a few days ago basically navigating some of that difference. But let's take it now to the Middle East. You asked about Syria and Iran. Syria is a perfect example of why, if you look at the reason why the defense of Israel is in American interests, it was, and I think the Iranian template now that we're using through the Trump administration's policy to defeat the IRGC, you look back and what happened in Syria, 14 years of a well-intended, long overdue revolution in Syria against the Assad regime, against the Baathists, was not successful. 900,000 souls perished in that battle out of 21 million Syrians. 10 to 12 million were displaced either internally or externally from Syria. And yet, what ultimately ended the Assad regime was 2 months of an Israeli operation at the end of 2024 that sealed the border. Russia gave up on bringing either money or weapons into Syria. Iran stopped the influx, and Israel did it from its own interest, mostly, in which Netanyahu said, enough with Hezbollah getting missiles into Syria from Iran, enough with the soldiers coming in then into Lebanon. So they started bombing at the border. They started attacking in a very systematic way, not just a one-off, one day at a time, but for 3 weeks. There was an operation that decimated the Assad regime. And that's why, I was not invited to the celebration when Assad finally left here in Phoenix, because the Syrian community sees me as, part of their conspiracy theory. But I said, if there's anyone that should get a statue in Damascus, it's Netanyahu for what happened at the end of the Assad regime, because he fled to Moscow. Iran jettisoned Syria, and Assad was no longer able to pay his soldiers. And that was the key. Russia stopped paying him, and Iran stopped sending weapons and military, and Assad didn't last 2 months till the end of December, and he was done. Now, you have a jihadist running Syria. We can talk about the next process. Part of that is still vestige of Obama-Biden policy, but still, bottom line is, just like Iran today, they would not have gotten to the stage of Islamism and Khomeinism had they not gone through a dictatorship phase of the Shah. So those phases are part of the normal evolution. Western democracy went through multiple phases of evolution and revolution until they got to liberal democracies. And even with that, they've ratcheted back to fascism in the early 20th century. So this is normal evolution. I think Shah in Syria hopefully has a short-lived regime. And the opening up of their markets will begin to bring the real. Syria has a significant, bright future because of how diverse it is. It's the most diverse country in the Middle East, with Kurds being 10, 20%, Sunni being 55, 60%, Shia being 10%, Alawi being 10%, Christians, and sadly, there's no more Jews left in Syria, which is, I remember so many times I had debates with friends. They said, oh, but, the Christians are only safe because of Assad. I'll tell them, listen, why are there no Jews left in Syria, during the Assad regime? He doesn't care about religion. He cares about the Ba'ath Party. So lastly, to the Iranian question, Iran's similar. President Trump 2 weeks ago, sitting with Xi, was able to stop the military armamentation and China's purchase of Iranian oil, and which is key. Our bombing has began to not only defang the IRGC, but has prevented a lot of their ability. Cutting the Straits of Hormuz stopped their economic viability of being able to pay their officers. So that regime is in surrender management mode right now. And it might last months yet, or even a couple years, but they are on life support, and the people are on the streets. We see them on the streets now. We will not need, and the reason I supported what we're doing in Iran, while I've been very open about the fact that many of us that supported the Iraq war realized, it took us too long, but we realized that you need to have movement on the ground first before you can decapitate a regime. We decapitated Iraq with no ground movement of any revolution, so we ended up owning it, which was a disaster. Same thing with Afghanistan. Iran is very different. Syria was very different. We decapitated Iran now multiple times, and there's a movement there that's going to start filling in the gaps. It may not be successful. It may take a lot yet more blood and revolution, but it is definitely far better today than it ever was in the last 47 years.
And when you talk about the blood, and you mentioned the 900,000 souls who lost their lives in Syria, who were murdered by the regime, where was there was no outrage. It's selective outrage. It's only it's a fantasy kind of movement where people are focusing on the people in Gaza, thinking that it was targeting civilians, when actually we see the targeting of civilians, and we saw it in Syria, in your parents' home country. We see it in Iran. I mean, in what was it, 2 days, 30,000 people or more lost their lives from the regime. It's really upsetting. And I'm wondering, how do we pump Western ideas of liberty and secular democracy directly to the people of the Middle East, particularly inside places like Iran? And it just doesn't seem like democracy has worked in these countries.
No, democracy is not the solution. Democracy is three wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner, right? I mean, and that's what happened in Egypt. It became a majoritocracy after the revolution. So they need a generation of infusion of liberal ideas, small L, muscular liberalism. And that's actually, Rabbi, the part of the Clarity Coalition that I didn't complete that thought completely for you. But
Please.
we said, listen, enough with the whack-a-mole defense. You need an offense. The Chinas and Qatars of the world, do you think they just want to just play games with universities, which is why they're dumping billions into Middle East studies programs? No, there is a offense to what they're doing to us. So I'm America first and not into sending my sons and daughters into war for no reason. I get that, and we learned a valuable lesson in the Bush era, and I think it's a well-deserved marginalization of a movement within my party to marginalize those who think that we can send troops and pound people into democracy. That does not work. But and Senator Rubio, now Secretary of State Rubio, has done a fantastic job in articulating why we need muscular liberalism. And I was very critical of what happened with, now, listen, the USAID, the Voice of America, a lot of those monies were being dumped into radical progressivism globally, a gay rights agenda, other agendas that is not really America's job to be pushing, and that's what Obama and others did. However, to gut it and then dismantle it makes no sense. That's surrender in the free market of ideas. So we need a forward. We won the war against the Soviets, which is what the Committee for the Present Danger did, by using Radio Free Europe to pump ideas into Eastern Bloc countries. Estonia now is one of the greatest free market countries on the planet, and that didn't happen overnight. Yes, the Soviets had to pull out, but ultimately it became a bastion of the ideas that we were pumping in there for decades. So we have none of that operation. Al-Hurra was a disaster as far as, operating in the normal social media milieu of what Iraq and other countries are. And we can still be allies with Saudi Arabia while still pushing ideas into there that they might not like. So this is the issue, is that we need to, and we're doing some of this now with Cuba. We did it a little bit top down with Venezuela. There are things we can do surgically, but there are other things we can do ideologically to help them transform themselves. It's not Americanizing them. It's simply allowing them to start to have an equal playing field for the folks that have ideas that we share. And this is the issue, is that if you look at the Hassan Pikers of the world, he goes to China and says how wonderful that country is and ignores the Uyghurs, ignores the plight. As you said, is that there's such a hypocrisy in the left and the progressivists, where to them it's about a collective message, and meanwhile they ignore the reality of what's happening to so many on the ground. And right now, if you look on the ground, there's going to be no greater pro-American country in the Muslim majority world than the Iranian country after the Islamists are gone, because they know what we did to help them finally realize their freedom. So it needs a strategy, and it's not that hard. It's about free market of ideas, which we will win every time, but we can't surrender it and just let the CCP and the Islamists fill in that with their red-green propaganda.
I know also you want to talk about anti-Semitism, but before we do that, let's talk about Israel for a moment. A core component of your foreign policy outlook is an unwavering commitment to America's strategic relationship with Israel. And as a Jew and as a rabbi, I deeply appreciate that. To many observers, a conservative Muslim championing the Zionist cause is seen as an anomaly. Why is it that you have such a deep, profound appreciation for the Jewish state?
Well, I have to tell you, it is a rational conclusion, not only as a human being, but as a student of history, as a student of trying to understand. When I look at the Jew hatred that exists among Muslim communities, especially Arab communities, it's not, there's two pathologies that give you, if you look at statistically, the State Department study in anti-Semitism, it runs in Jordan, for example, 94%, in Egypt, 88%, in Lebanon, 96%, Indonesia, 85%. So why is it so high among Muslim majority countries? Political Islam is a big part of that, but it's also Arabism. So Arabism is, the Jamal Abdel Nasser's of Egypt, the dictator, which was my grandfather's main nemesis, as he had a newspaper that was nationalized by Egypt, Syria's joint socialist, national socialist fascist party. Jamal Abdel Nasser was the fascist.
Only he pronounced it Gamal, didn't he, in Egypt?
Yeah, exactly, but there's no ga.
Right.
I guess you're right. There is a ga in Egyptian Arabic, but
I'm just giving you a hard time.
You're right. He did. So, that is the Nazi party of Egypt, just like Assad's Ba'ath party was the Nazi party of Syria. So the protocols of the Elders of Zion, a Soviet-Russian document from the early 20th century that demonized the Jewish community, basically fueled the Arabist anti-Semitism, which had very little to do with Islamist anti-Semitism, but yet went hand in hand, parallel in demonizing the other. And you look at the reason for the need for Israel to exist, and you look at its real history about the land that was sold from individuals that sold their lands, and how it was actually, and my grandfather, a businessman in Syria who had many in the Jewish community in Aleppo that he worked with before they all were, basically forced out. He taught me at a very young age, as he did my dad, that ultimately it is not about the conflict. There is no conflict between Islam and Judaism. There is no conflict, ultimately. The Israeli state, if you will, gave the Palestinians and the Arabs so many opportunities. And as Golda Meir said, they never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. They constantly, had borders that they refused to accept, and then it expanded and expanded because they were invading and terrorizing and committing acts of heinous inhumanity against Israel. And Israel only was defending itself and basically protecting itself generation to generation. So that's the rational assessment. And then I look at the human assessment, having close Jewish friends and others, and realizing that at the core of anti-Semitism, and realizing the modern concept of anti-Semitism became a demonization of Israel. And as an American, the kid of two parents who loved America the moment they came here because they felt American the moment they came here, Israel is very much like the little America in the Middle East. It has a very vibrant economy, free market, where Jewish communities from all over the planet can come there and immediately feel Israeli. And yes, there are Muslims. A sixth of the population is Arabic there, with a Sharia court. I've visited Israel twice. You realize not only how normal the country is and Western it is, but how free the Sharia. And I talked to the Sharia judges in Israel. The first question I asked them, I said, the most important question to me as a Muslim is, who do you use as your reference, your precedence when you're setting law here? Because that's ultimately what defines whether you're modern or not. And they gave me the answer that I respected the most of any Sharia person I've spoken to. They said, we don't have any. We make our own precedent. I said, that's the right answer. Thank you. Because if you use Al-Azhar, if you use, Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabis, they're still using 12th to 13th century Shafi'i Maliki texts. So they are young judges making their own precedent, which proves how modern Israel is. So to me, if you look and understand human nature, there is nothing more defining. And as many of the people who are more philosophical and more quoted in history has always said, as a famous rabbi said, first it was they came for the Jews, then other faiths. The issue is that it is easiest to demonize people that are not present in the room or present in groups in which you can demonize and become victims. And the Jewish community, because of their small population, because proselytization is not a major part of the faith, there's barely 14 million globally. So it's easy to demonize that community. And to me, as a physician who treats disease and humanity, it is really and in medicine, we talk about pathognomonic conditions. A pathognomonic condition means that somebody with a cough or fever has a certain constellation of symptoms that then guides you to learn about what other diseases it could be. Anti-Semitism is a pathognomonic condition for human frailty, in which the first thing that comes, you'd start to generate hate and then ignore every other condition you have that needs treatment. And that's why DEI ended up with anti-Semitism, why the right, when it became hyper-nationalist, started to inculcate the Candace Owens of the world with crazy ideas, because they were deflecting their own condition upon a global, upon the other, upon a sense of tribalism, as they are the victims of Islamist and CCP power, versus actually saying, you know what, let's come together and unite and advance an offense against those guys, instead of blaming the other, which was about conspiracy theories, etc. You know, when you look at the allies that we have, whether it's NATO, countries that we need to come together when one is attacked, we're all attacked, is one of the premises that saves Western liberal democracies. In Europe is a whole other conversation you and I should have maybe at some point. Is Europe is really doomed because Americanism, we all have access to as immigrants to embrace immediately. Europe's secular democracies are race-based, language-based, so they're not going to have access for Muslims coming through to separate the Islamists. So Islamists really continue to hijack those communities. And you see today, I saw a video out of Paris, which is just scary, of what's happening in those countries. And they're going to tribalize more so. And actually, that's exactly what the Islamists want. So as I look at the support of Israel, to me as an American, there is so much there that makes it in our mutual interest, not only strategically with its presence in the Middle East, but ideologically in our future. Because if we don't navigate the reason, if I can't convince my kids and my grandkids when they come, God willing, of why I, as a human being, support the state of Israel and why I would fight with them, and why, as a Navy officer, it is my war if Israel is attacked. To see them just as, oh, a foreign nation, the Massey ideology where, oh, it's just isolationism. Um, it's eventually going to come here. And yes, our founding fathers didn't want to fight other people's wars, but if you wait till it's on your shore and you don't fight it over the horizon, which is really what I think President Trump is doing right now. It's over the horizon battles, which is much better than waiting till they're on your shores. Israel is at the tip of the spear, and we have the mechanism to do that. Ideologically, the anti-Semitism, I would tell you domestically, when we are looking at promoting the ideas that you and I started this conversation at the beginning, anti-Semitism is the polar opposite of what are the positive things. You can't defeat something you're against unless you talk about what you're for. And that's why our Clarity Coalition, we are champions for liberty against the reality of Islamist tyranny. So if we're against anti-Semitism, I would ask anyone who tries to minimize that to say that, do you really think it's a coincidence that we are falling apart as a country on those 80-20 issues? And anti-Semitism now is thriving? Those two things go together. If we can't figure out what we're for, the what we're against people are going to continue to use that to virally destroy our country.
You have spoken passionately about accountability, that God holds every individual accountable for their actions, whether it's for yourself, your family, or the world. You said it's our job to speak out against things that are unethical, wrong, or evil. In a political climate where people are terrified of being canceled or called Islamophobic, and I realize that you take issues with that word altogether, where do you find the fortitude to look at your own faith community and say, this is wrong, this is un-Islamic, and we have to set the record straight?
Well, thank you for asking me that, because it's actually at the core of who I am. I do think life is short. I believe that as much as, my life now, 58 years, and God only knows how long it's going to be. You'll be judged, and there's a saying of the prophet, we believe there's two angels on your shoulder, one that registers every little thing you do that's good, and one that registers every little thing you do that's bad. All our faiths have these similar metaphors. Um, and there'll be a ledger in which on the day of judgment, God will judge me on those things. And I do think that legacy is important, but that legacy would mean nothing to me if I didn't have that first thing, which is that relationship with God. And to me, America gave me a laboratory in which I could have that relationship. So God says, okay, live in a society where you can drink alcohol because God can judge me that I've made a choice not to drink. Live in a society where I can speak lies and deceive people and not pray or pray, and God will be able to judge whether I did or not. Do I see the same thing at my kitchen table with my family that I do on podcasts and nationally? So this is things that you have to live in a laboratory of freedom. This is why when I was in college, and I'm still very libertarian. Not completely, as we could talk about drug laws and things like that, where as you get older as a parent, you realize that pure libertarianism has some issues for society. But at the end of the day, civil libertarianism is very important. But my relationship with God, to me, when I elect people, I don't really care which faith they have. And part of our reform movement is about admitting as Muslims that we don't have exclusivity to heaven, that there are many other pathways. But I do hope they have a greater power that they respond to, that they hold themselves in check to, because at the end of the day, most of our leaders, we know 1 out of 1,000 decisions they make. And as a doctor for patients, I feel that many of them trust me because they know when they see other decisions I make in their absence as their doctor, when they're under anesthesia, whatever it is, they trust that I'm going to do what's in their best interest and what I promised them I would do for them, not just based on my own values. And that's why I think the study of medical ethics is so important. One of the things we teach our students is that true medical ethics is not only just having a moral compass yourself, but actually being able to manifest and act for your patients in their moral compass as you understand theirs to be. So this is important in representation. And I think as we look at America, I think what makes America successful, and de Tocqueville's books had a huge impact on me as a scholar, where de Tocqueville said what made America successful in its democracy or republic is that, and why it didn't need military authority, was that they feared God, that their neighbors, and really he's talking about they didn't commit acts of terror, etc., because you'd need a military regime to prevent restaurants and others from being threatened. We talk about, I just heard today, the Jewish community spends $800 million a year on security for their synagogues in America. I
Yeah,
can't even understand how much money that is if it was used for things for their own faith, for our society. How
absolutely.
much better that would be spent, but yet you have to. And the bottom line is we're losing God. Progressivism is not about God. And I don't want to dictate people's faiths, but we need a community that equally fear God, if you will, and want to be righteous and want to be humanitarian, because that ultimately is what will make us a successful republic and a successful modern democracy.
Amen. Our listeners should know that my social media feed is actually saturated with amazing Muslims, some of whom are quite religious, like Loai al-Sharif,
Oh, yeah.
Dalia Ziada, and Amjad Taha, who absolutely love Israel and love Jews and Christians. I'm quite familiar with Muslims like you, Dr. Jasser, who are trying to move the Ummah into a much better chapter. Still, there is a widespread surface level assumption among many non-Muslims that any authentic iteration of Islam must inherently be triumphalist, meaning its ultimate goal must be the total Islamization of the globe, whether through the sword or the demographic shift. How do you respond to that fear?
Whether it's globalization of the Chinese Communist Party, the globalization of the Soviets, today's biggest threat is the Islamist threat. And that's why what we're doing in Iran is so important. That's why they can't have a nuclear weapon. To them, mutually assured destruction is a goal. It's not an obstacle like it was for the Soviets. So, there is a significant threat, and we need to understand and embody that understanding and counter that. But if you want to look at solutions, the best solution against that threat is Muslims from the inside that can take back the narrative of Islam. Because if you surrender the identification of being Muslim and that relationship with God and that moral compass, as much as the United States has fought threats that we thought we could never defeat, whether it was the Soviets, whether we have the threat now of the CCP in World War II, significant threats. At the end of the day, yes, today's threat, the greatest thing is not only the Islamists of the Khomeinists and of the Muslim Brotherhood, but also the CCP. If you're going to counter that, the best asset we have is within the Muslim community. And I want to make a plug for my book, which actually, it's
Please
called
do.
it's a battle for the soul of Islam, and wrote it in 2013. It looks at solutions. It not only has my family's narrative at the beginning, but then looks at the end, what are some of the solutions and why that solution within is really the only pathway towards protecting and saving the West, because you've got a quarter of the world's population that's Muslim. They are dominated. Normative Islam is the problem, absolutely. And as Glenn Beck, my friend, refers to me as the radical, I tell him, yes, I am the radical, but it took Western Christendom 1789 years until you had a legal document that was signed and believed by Western thought leaders to be a government that could actually allow that pathway to Jesus and God to be realized by their societies. So Islam has not gone through that yet. If the recipe was bad itself, Bernard Lewis' book, The Jews of Islam, the work of Maimonides, and so many others would not have happened under Muslim control if it hadn't been somewhat have the recipe of an open culture, open society. Those were not democracies. Those were dynasties that had autocratic components to it. But at the time, there was no secular democracy anywhere in the world in the 8th and 9th century. So,
True.
it's a bit of a jujitsu to say, well, those are Islam has never had democracy. It's still young. But if you're going to look at solutions, we have to, as a community, look at solutions. And there are Muslims here in America that you cannot dismiss as being somehow random, mutations. We're not mutations. Many of us believe in our faith. We have a strong and are doing this. And you asked me before, why do you do this? It's really because I have a very personal love with God that animates who I am. And I feel like he gave me some gifts that I need to make the most of while I'm on this earth. And, people should look at our work. We're open for debate on these things. I don't feel like I have all the answers. We're looking for more answers, but I love this country. And if you leave Americanism to this debate of the extremes, we will lose who we are as a country. And it's really the last best hope, as Lincoln describes it in his sayings and in the Civil War afterwards. We survived that Civil War because we were the last best hope for mankind.
I want to ask you one final question, if I may. If you find yourself, and I hope you do, by the way, if you find yourself in the halls of Congress next year, representing District 4, what is the ultimate promise of Americanism that you want to restore for the families living here in Arizona?
That's a great question. To me, the ultimate promise is that every human being, every husband, every wife, every father, mother, as you raise a child, you hope for them that you can give them the gift of what that promise meant to you, to them. And if we can't give that to the next generation so that it can define themselves, my daughter just graduated from Tucson, and one of her, as she was talking to our family and at our gathering, she said she wanted to be seen and realized. And that's really all it is that, are we raising kids? Do we have a community, a culture that it's not tolerance is a very patronizing thought process in which we tolerate others and we just give them the freedom to be lesser people, versus pluralism, versus e pluribus unum, which is, out of many one. It's that, are we the many? Are we a salad bowl, or are we a soup that dissolves and burns everybody into one type of homogeneity? No, we are a salad bowl. We are a diverse community, and we are powered by our diversity. The Elon Musks of the world aren't living in European democracies. They're not living in the Middle East. They're living in America for a reason, but we're losing that edge. And to me, that promise is that every human being that is raised in the next generation can have that. And you can see it as a free market dream. You can see it as a dream of ownership, as a dream of faith practice. Do you feel, I want our kids, for example, to believe in God because they believe in it. And we tell them, have the debate, reject God if you want, but hopefully you'll come to accepting him because you believe it, not because you were told to or coerced into it.
What a pleasure, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Thank you for gracing us on the Rabbi Avi Show. I pray that you will be also known as Representative Zuhdi Jasser in the months ahead. And may Allah continue to bless you and your family and the entire nation here. And you've given us lots of food for thought. We'll put a lot of your important points in the show notes there and look forward to continuing this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rabbi. And please, anyone interested in helping our campaign, it's Z4AZ, Z number 4AZ.com, because it's really more than a campaign. It's about a movement to bring back sanity and a normal conversation to America. Thank you.
Beautiful. Take care. And that was Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. What an extraordinary, wide-ranging conversation. After speaking with Dr. Jasser, I am reminded of what true moral courage sounds like in a political landscape that is so often dominated by shallow 10-second sound bites and hyper-tribalism. There is so much to unpack from what he shared, from his brilliant clinical analogy of building medical coalitions to solve problems, to his defense of muscular liberalism and the free market of ideas over kinetic military intervention. I'm particularly moved by his reminder that true freedom requires a laboratory where virtue is a choice, not a product of state or religious coercion. Whether you agree with every single one of his policy platforms or not, you cannot deny the absolute consistency of his character and his profound patriotism. If you want to look at the documents we mentioned during the episode, including the 2-page declaration of the Muslim Reform Movement, we have placed those links directly in the show notes for you. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, and head over to patreon.com/horizontal media to help us keep these vital independent conversations alive. I'm Rabbi Avi Alpert, Tizkula Mitzvot, and we'll see you next time.